Well, it's quite a big change to me from where I've been living, from the snowbank. Children want me to give a brief sketch and outline of my life and child family. I might state that my father's name was William Alfred Child, born in Ogden. My grandfather's name was Arvil Child. My great-grandfather's name was Arvil Ransler Child. He's the heir of the Child family. We have a large family in the state of Utah. We have our reunions once a year, and several hundred of our people gather together, the Child family. We've traced our genealogy back for many generations. We find that the Child family are from England. They came over to this country in the year 1830. We trace our line through one Benjamin Child, who came about 1830, or about 20 years after the Puritans arrived in this country. Our family from there goes on into England and connects up with the royal families, the families of the kings. We have a coat of arms, and our temple work has been done for many generations back. I was born in Plain City, Utah, year 1887, month of October, a very little town out west of Ogden. My grandfather owned a homestead where Ogden City now stands, the center of Ogden City. And should he have kept that homestead, he would have someday been a wealthy man. But he moved out into Star Valley, Wyoming, and my father went with him when I was 6 months old. The first winter in Wyoming was a tough winter. They had what is known as a hard winter. The snow was very deep, and they were snowbound in this valley, 50 miles from civilization, over vast mountains and deep snow. They were marooned and unable to obtain food. My father made one trip over the mountain, 50 miles, into Montpelier, Idaho, carried 50 pounds of flour on his back on snowshoes, the only flour we had in all winter. My parents lived that winter on fish and wild meats for about 5 months. Of course, I was too young to remember this. My diet was strictly milk. Father's cows all starved to death that winter. 13 of them he had to kill, shot down in the corral for the lack of feed. But we survived and went on. Our home was very humble, a log house with dirt roof and that of a pioneer. It took my parents 11 days to travel 50 miles going over into that valley. And they went through many hardships. My mother raised her family in this valley where there were no doctors. She obtained blood poison and was an invalid for many years. We had poor schools in there. First school I ever remember going to, my father used to carry me on his back on snow skis. The snow was so deep we couldn't get around in that valley. Sometimes the snow was 5 feet deep in the level of the valley, and much deeper in the mountains. And all the children had to go to school on snow skis. And about 10 years later, they finally got enough population there that we could drive teams in the wintertime. And the snow skis were abandoned, and now we had the horse age. And then about 20 or 30 years later came the automobiles into the valley. There was great fishing and hunting in that valley. We had lots of deer and game, elk. There was 4 in my family. We had 4 children. Marzella, a little girl which died when she was very young. And I had a sister by the name of Elizabeth. She died when she was 7 years of age. With appendicitis. That's the first time we ever heard of that dreaded disease. And it nearly killed my mother and parents when they lost this fine girl. She was a beautiful girl with long black curls, ringlets, and large dark eyes. And my last sister, which I missed very much when she passed away. Just a few years later, I contracted the disease when I was 13 years of age, and come very near losing my life also. We were then living in this same log house and dirt roof, and I became ill very suddenly. And we had an old doctor in the valley which didn't know very much in those days. He came over and looked me over and said he thought I had appendicitis, which frightened the family very much because my sister had just died a couple of years before. But after watching me close for 3 or 4 days and waiting till my appendix bursted, this doctor said he knew then as appendicitis. And Father wanted him to operate on me, but he said he couldn't because there was no hospital in the valley, and besides he'd have to have a doctor to help him. It looked like there's no chance for me to live. Father determined to get some more help, and he sent out into Idaho for another doctor, which they relayed with teams as fast as they could travel into the valley, and in about 24 hours an old Dr. Pointer from Idaho arrived, and looking me over, he shook his head and said, "Well, you're a pretty sick lad," and he said I'd have to be operated on to live. So I said, "Well, get your knife out and let's operate. I'm not ready to die yet." So they went out back of the house and they brought in an old carpenter bench, and that they used for my operating table. And remember, our hospital was just a log cabin with a dirt roof. And I was now in the last stage of peritonitis. Blood poison had developed. They proceeded and operated. When they cut into me, the pus shot clear to the ceiling, and blood poison had so developed that the doctor shook his head. Said, "There's no use, so you'll just bind him up. He'll only live a few hours." So they wrapped me up and never even sewed my wound, left me to die. And the old doctor went back to Montpelier, Idaho. But I laid there and finally started to improve, and I didn't die. I lived on, and about a month later the old doctor came back and looked me over. When he turned the blankets down, my wound had completely healed. There was no wound in my side whatsoever, and He said nature had certainly done wonders for me, that my life had been preserved, because he didn't think that I could live 2 hours in my condition. He called it nature, but I believe it was the faith and prayers of my parents and people and the community there where I lived. I believe that the Lord had a hand in preserving my life, and that I was to live to raise a family, which I have done. Perhaps the next important thing in my life was when I was 18 years old. I was called on a mission. Very suddenly departed for the western states, where I spent 2 years. But unfortunately, notwithstanding, I had a grand mission and some wonderful experience, and which was a wonderful school to me, and increased my faith and testimony and knowledge in the things which I had been taught by my parents. After spending nearly 2 years, I was stricken with typhoid fever and came home with this dreaded disease, where I laid in bed for nearly 2 months and at the point of death. But through all of this, I have survived and have been a very strong, powerful man ever since. My life has been made beautiful. When I was through with my mission, I went to the BY College 2 years, Logan, where I did very fine, appreciated my studies and did excellent. I made a wonderful record while I was in school, and would have liked to went longer. I had a desire, but things turned to the adverse for me, and in the meantime I met my future wife-to-be. This was quite an important point in one's life, I think, in selecting their proper companion, and rather amusing how we met. I've often thought about it. We were living there in Star Valley. I had a number of girlfriends I had met and thought quite a lot of after I'd come off my mission. Very fine girls, and I wasn't quite decided in my mind what was my best procedure till one day I went fishing down on the river, and a crowd of young folks and my parents. While fishing along on the river, there was a young girl fishing along ahead of me, and I came down, and her name was Minnie. And as I approached where she was fishing, as a joke, we started laughing. I says, I believe if I'd cast right out there, I might be able to catch a Minnie. And we had quite a joke and laugh about it, and she took the hint, and that night I took Minnie to the dance. That was the beginning of our romance, which ended when I was 22 years of age. We went to the Salt Lake Temple and were married. The first part of our married life was very fine. However, this fine girl that I selected was not too strong in her health, and our first baby that was born about 9 or 10 months after our marriage died. Baby boy was born dead. And then we lost 2 more baby boys which didn't live. One of these boys lived just a few hours, and I blessed him and gave him the name of Rodney. Our next boy was Kenneth, who was born to us, and he lived very good, with the exception of a few sick spells in his early childhood. And Howard and Grace, we lived on a ranch up in Wyoming, where I prospered very much. In between times, I taught school for several years, made a little extra money, and finally drifted into ranching. I bought some fine land and some fine stock and leased a big ranch from my father-in-law for 15 years, where I went into the cattle raising business dairying and hay producing. And prosperity seemed to come to me, and in those 15 years I accumulated about over 100 head of Hereford cattle and a dairy herd of about 25 head of registered Holstein cows, which made me some very fine money. While we were prospering along, I did some work in the church there and other things. I used to do quite a lot of orchestra work, played in bands and orchestras 3 and 4 nights a week, which brought in quite a few dollars, and I also enjoyed that very much. In the year 1819, my wife took sick. The flu came through the country, this terrible European flu which came through, and about the time of after the armistice, everything went on the blink throughout the nation. The same time my wife took sick with the flu, and it left her an invalid. She never did recover. For 3 years she was practically helpless. The last 2 years she was unable to even comb her own hair or cook a meal or to even hardly dress herself. So this made a big handicap to me, and I started spending money on doctors and used all of the power we had to rectify her trouble, which didn't seem to come. After consulting 4 or 5 doctors in the valley, I took her out into the state of Idaho to other doctors and gave her the very best care that we possibly could. Finally, we were told by one of the doctors that she'd have to move from that cold country. It's a very cold climate. It snows very deep, and it used to get around 55 degrees below zero in the winter. And they said that she couldn't live in that cold country any longer, so I proceeded to sell out, or to move out, rather. I had to move quite suddenly on this account, and I turned over some of my cattle and hay and things that I had accumulated in these 15 years and to one of my trusted neighbors. And he agreed to ship my cattle and to pay me when he got his returns from the shipments shipping them east. But to my sorrow and after knowledge, I discovered that he had planned right there to take advantage of me and my condition. And instead of shipping the cattle and paying me for them, he turned them in as his cattle on a debt, and after which I tried to make settlement, and he had embezzled some of his own cattle, and the bank foreclosed on him, and he turned my cattle in to save himself from the penitentiary, which worked a hardship on me. He agreed, however. He talked like he wanted to make it good, and he gave me his notes for the amount of $6,500. But he never did recover his notes or pay anything excepting 1 team of horses on that great big bill. This loss and other losses in doctors and funeral expenses, and after my wife died, I was left even without a home and was penniless, and all I had left at the end of 3 years was the 3 children which were left on my hands, and I had to be father and mother from there on. So we had quite a hard struggle for some time. After 4 or 5 years, I finally found another very fine woman which stepped in and took hold of the reins with me and helped me to go on and raise these children, which I think she did a very fine job and won the love of the children, and I also won my love and filled in part the loss which I had encumbered by my previous sorrows. I don't know what else I might say. Through it all, I have tried to be cheerful and still try to go on and be happy. I'm enjoying my visit out here a lot with the children, and I don't know when I'll have this chance again. In fact, I rather feel that it might be my last chance. Life is slipping by, and it's uncertain. We don't know just what the outcome will be. But I want to say this, that the Child family, both from my father's family and my mother's, were very devout in the church. And we were taught properly in our homes to live the gospel, and my mother used to teach me when I was a babe by her side, and I think those teachings have always been a safeguard to me as I've drifted through the world. I've always tried to be what my mother wanted me to be, and hope I can do that to the end. I'd like to say just a word or two about my mother's people. My mother was a tailor. She was a daughter of Joseph Taylor, who was an old pioneer and a member of the Mormon Battalion. He left the Mormon Company in 1840, I think it was 1848, or the time the Mormon Battalion left, and he traveled down through the United States into Old Mexico by foot, clear around into California with the Mormon Battalion. He was a very large man, about 6'2", and weighed about 225 pounds. As I remember him, he had a long gray beard. I used to sit and listen to his stories when I was a little boy. Told me about the march of the battalion, how they suffered, and he said that about the only food they had in traveling was parched corn. Seems as though the general was rather abusive to the Mormon men. There's 500 of them, and they used to march until through the dry deserts, thousands of miles on foot, and he said they suffered a great deal for the want of water. Said they used to march until their tongues would turn black and stick and hang out of their mouths. And some of them would faint and fall over and were unable to get in at night. And he used to go back and pick up his friends and get them in during the night and get them up. He also was taken prisoner by the Johnson's army after he got back into Utah, and was held prisoner as a spy under the directions of Brigham Young when this army came in to annihilate the Mormons. He was while in this prison, he was kept captive in a tent where he's guarded by men and guns and ordered to shoot if he tried to disappear or tried to leave. After about 3 months of persecution and torture, he finally made up his mind that he's going to get out of there, and he took a great chance on his life. While in here, they used to smoke him and torture him until he was almost blind, and they fed him on poison soups. So one night he made a getaway and nearly froze to death, and he was near starved. He stopped along the path and ate on the carcass of a dead sheep. I used to be quite thrilled as a little boy when he'd tell me these stories, and however, he lived to be 84 years of age, very sturdy and active right to his last day. Grandmother Taylor, that's my mother's mother, her name was Jane Lake Taylor. She was also a pioneer and Went through all the mobbings in Missouri when she was a little girl and was in Nauvoo at the time of the martyrdom of the prophet. She was personally acquainted with the prophet, and as a little girl she used to sit on his lap and he'd tell her stories. And she used to sit and tell me of the times when they were mobbed and their home was burned. She said her home was burned 3 times, and she, while traveling from Jackson County, Missouri into Nauvoo, Illinois, several hundred miles or perhaps nearly 1,000 miles in the dead of winter, they were on foot and barefooted. Children were running in all directions, and parents hunting their children, laying out in the cold winter nights. She said that you could follow their trail by their blood from their bare feet in the snow in the wintertime. When she'd tell me these stories, her heart would fill with sorrow. I used to sit on her lap when I was a little boy, and she'd tell me all about it. And she would get to thinking about it and about her brothers and sisters and some that had lost their lives. She'd always break down into tears and cry. And of course I love grandmother very much. She's a wonderful woman, very faithful and devoted to her religion. And when she would cry, I would cry also, and we'd have a good crying time together. I love Grandmother Taylor very much, and I used to, after she'd tell me all about it, I'd say, "Grandma, do you believe that Joseph Smith was a prophet? Do you think he was a prophet of God?" And she'd straighten up and she'd say, "I don't believe it, son, but I know that he's a prophet." And for that reason she picked up all she had and her belongings, which she said she could hold in her apron, and put it into a handcart and started for the valleys of the Rocky Mountains, and went through all the trials and tribulations. While coming along this trail, one day she discovered the dead body of one of her brothers, which had been shot by the Indians and was laying out along the side of the trail with arrows through his body. And these things, of course, naturally caused her much sorrow. She said that many of them died. She told about the time their days in winter quarters when 1,200 of them were frozen and starved to death and died from disease in one winter. And as they traveled along, they had no way to bury their dead except just dig a little hole and shove a little dirt over them and go on. She suffered very much after she came into Utah. First summer she had to go out with her brothers and sisters and parents, and they lived on what they called seagulls. It's a flower with a little bulb on the bottom of it like a little onion. She said that's all the food they had to eat, and that sustained their life. She was there during the plague of the crickets and the coming of the seagulls, which we have read and know so well in history. She went through all of this and raised a fine family. I've always felt that grandmother was a wonderful woman, and I know that she earned a wonderful reward. She was a polygamist. Grandfather had 2 women. And my mother was also a very devout woman and very faith-promoting to talk with. Well, I don't know. I think I've pretty well covered the program. There's, of course, a lot of minor things in my life that I could think of maybe, but may not interest anybody. But life has been worthwhile, and I've done lots of good. Me and my wife are at present working in the Indian Mission. And I've been recently have converted quite a lot of the Indians and baptized them. And I think it's wonderful work to work among the Indian people. I'm anxious to get back and get in this work and while I've enjoyed my trip out here in the midwinter and see the green grass and everything. I've enjoyed it immensely. One of the outstanding pleasures of my life to be with my children. And I hope my children will always remember our teachings of their parents and their ancestors, and be devoted to their religion. And I hope that you will tend to your duties and be true Latter-day Saints, have your prayers, and attend to your duties as true members of this church. And I know the Lord will bless you. And this is my counsel, and I want to leave my testimony with my own children, that I know that Mormonism is true and the gospel is true. I've seen it manifest and witnessed it many times, healings and power of the Lord. And now I feel like bidding you farewell and ask God to bless all of you, that we might meet again. And I want you to come and see me as often as you can, and we'd be happy as long as we can. Well, goodbye all of you, and be good kids, all of you.